Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the key to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, where we keep the information flow going until your PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner, and as you may have guessed from this opening, the lesson is all about managing communications on your project. Have you ever heard the expression about how the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing? Well, you don't want that on your project. You, as the project manager, the team members and stakeholders, you should all be appropriately informed regarding what's going on your project. So in this lesson, we discuss the role of language and knowing your audience in managing communications. We also discuss key steps in effective communications. We look at the managed communications process and compare it with other processes within project communications management. Specifically, we compare managed communications to control communications. We present the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs of the process, where we focus on what it is that stakeholders really want to know. We introduce new tools and techniques, but also revisit familiar ones, which are also used in the planned communications process. And we see that project communications are the main outputs of this process, but there are many others which are also important. The goal of managed communications is timely, efficient, and effective communication flow amongst stakeholders. We have quite a bit to say about this process, so this lesson is cut into our two standard parts. Part 1, overview and inputs. Part 2, tools, techniques, outputs, and the review. Let's begin with our overview. Project communications management is the knowledge area that includes the processes that are required to ensure timely and appropriate planning, collection, creation, distribution, storage, retrieval, management, control, monitoring, and the ultimate disposition of project information. And for all of that, we have 3 processes defined and described in the PMBOK guide. The first one is Plan Communications Management. This is the process of developing an appropriate approach and plan for project communications based on stakeholders' information needs and requirements and available organizational assets. Then we move on to Manage Communications. This is the process of creating, collecting, distributing, storing, retrieving, and then also the ultimate disposition of our project information in accordance with the communications management plan that we developed in our first process. And lastly, we also need to control communications in the process of monitoring and controlling communications throughout the entire project lifecycle to ensure that the information needs of the project stakeholders are met. In our previous lesson, we covered the first of these 3 processes, Plan Communications Management. This is part of the planning process group. Right now, we focus on the second process, Manage Communications, which is under the Executing process group. And then in our final and next lesson, we cover Control Communications, which is part of the Monitoring and Controlling process group. In regards to the main concept behind the process, let me answer the question, what does it mean to manage communications? Well, you could say that it's showtime. Perhaps this is a bit obvious, but this is where your team and stakeholders and you yourself actively communicate with each other. Remember all those elements and activities that you saw in the boxes a few slides back in our knowledge area overview slide? Well, this is the process where you perform all those steps that are in between planning and monitoring and controlling. So, manage communications is where you execute communications based on the communications plan. It is where you create, collect, and distribute the information, and manage communications is also where you store, retrieve, and dispose of the communication and the information. Managing communications is all about enabling efficient and effective communication flow. You want the right information to be available to the right people at the right time in a way that the information is not only received but understood. Let's look ahead, because it is important to be clear on the difference between the manage communications process and the control communications process, which is of course the topic of our next lesson there. As our main concept, we said that manage communications is when you execute and follow the communications management plan, as opposed to control communications, where you check and compare what you actually do in manage communications against what is on the communications management plan. Managed communications is then where you create, send and distribute communications. Here you should adhere to the content, format, frequency and method as it is specified in the project communications management plan. But then control communications is where you review your communication. You ask, did the communication contain the right level and accurate information? Was it sent in the appropriate frequency and through the appropriate method? You may even send surveys to recipients to see if project communications met their expectation needs or if it requires improvement. Managed communication is where you perform the steps of storing and disposing of information, and control communications is where you might audit or monitor this process. For example, the communications management plan may say that hard copy documents with original signatures should be kept for up to 3 years after the project is completed, after which they can be disposed of in a manner that is in accordance with your company policy, which you know means that there is a company contracted to shred all your documents off-site. So you may use the terms manage communications and control communications quite loosely in your everyday conversations, but for the PMP exam you need to distinguish and understand the meaning of each of these in regards to terms and process. Before we move on, let's talk about language. When we talk about communication, it would be difficult not to discuss this topic. I'd like you to consider language as a critical success factor for your projects. Because this training is in English, because the PMP exam is mostly in English, and because many projects are nowadays managed worldwide and use English as their official language, we often forget that other languages exist. They are still a factor. If your communication is distributed and your deliverables are implemented around the world, then you must consider local languages as part of constraints and assumptions for your approach to managing communications. For instance, a constraint might be that because this is a multilingual project, all project communication must be published in English, German, and French, or training in our office in Beijing must be in Mandarin and not in English, or that we employ the traditional British English spelling in all external communication. It is also important to remember that at times people use industry or field or expert language, meaning information technology folks or doctors, engineers, scientists and technical experts, or lawyers and accountants, or people in many other professions, including myself here talking about the PMP exam. We do speak English, but many times when we get carried away with what we are saying, we use very complex industry slang, and we present things in such a way that it is almost as if we were speaking a different language. So you need to adjust your language to suit your audience. If you were on a medical research project speaking in front of a group of doctors, you may use words like ulna or femur, but if you are talking to others, call it the elbow bone or the thigh bone. Speak in layman terms so you can be sure that you are understood. The examples of our language may influence your projects are endless. Therefore, by giving the appropriate thought to language in your communications, you will achieve the following 3 items. You increase the chance of communication being received and correctly understood. You will also achieve that you show cultural awareness towards your stakeholders. And of course, these 2 together will help you strengthen the chances of project success. Remember, language and writing style is a critical success factor in your communications management plan. In order to increase the effectiveness of your communication, you can follow a process, and here are 6 general steps that can help you increase that effectiveness. Step 1 is identify the information needs. Your communications management plan will identify the information that needs to be distributed in order to keep your stakeholders informed of the project's progress. You should continuously review the plan and ensure that the information needs have not changed. In other words, you need to know all about the what, how and when and other details around the information needs of your stakeholders. Step number 2, know your audience. Now that you have identified what needs to be communicated, the next step is to not only identify who should receive the message, but also to determine what format it should be sent in. You want to make sure that all communication is created in the format that your stakeholders are expecting. Step 3, define your communication schedule. By now, you know what you are sending and to whom. The next step is to identify the timing and frequency of the communications message. Usually, this means that you will schedule regular communications. For example, your stakeholders should expect to receive a status report every Friday. But sending out communications does not necessarily have to be triggered by a date. It can also be triggered because a certain event has happened. For instance, your communications schedule can include rules such as if we are more than 10% ahead of or behind our schedule, we will send out a notice. Remember also that you don't communicate just for communication's sake. You communicate to keep your stakeholders appraised and ward off any problems. Be prepared to change the schedule if you are not meeting their needs. Step 4 is select media and format. We now have the information recipients and the schedule defined. Now we can effectively define the media and format of our message. There are a number of different types of formats that we can choose from: verbal presentations, written reports, memos, letters, emails, and so on. It is also important for you to be aware of the sender-receiver model, which we looked at in the communications overview lesson, in order to understand the importance of overcoming barriers or noise in the communication. Step 5 is prepare the information for distribution. In this step, it is once again important to focus on the recipient. We already covered the importance of choosing and adjusting our language to suit the audience. Your writing style, choice of words, usage of graphics, and so on should be appropriate to their needs and expectations. And as you prepare your message, don't forget to think ahead to the next step, which is communicating the information, by the way. But by knowing how the message will eventually be communicated, you can make appropriate changes. For instance, your message will look vastly different in a press release than in a formal presentation to your change control board. And then we are moving on to step 6, which is communicate the information. At this point, the message will be delivered. If it is a written message, you will use the selected media to transport the information to the recipient. If it is delivered in person, you will now have to use some of your other skills to manage communications. These include your presentation techniques, listening techniques, facilitation techniques, and meeting management techniques. Let's move forward and cover the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs, the ITTOs, of the managed communications process. You can see there are 4 inputs, 5 tools and techniques, and 4 outputs for us to consider and review in our lesson. And you will also see many familiar words here, such as the various documents, plans, reports, updates, factors, and assets. Let's look at them in detail. We have 4 inputs to this process, and the first one is the communications management plan. This one is obvious. We need this plan because it tells us what information we're supposed to send out to whom, when it will be sent, how they will receive it, and who is going to send it. We also have the work performance reports and enterprise environmental factors. This makes total sense as well. I want to look at those from a different angle, though, because often your stakeholders are going to ask you one pertinent question about your project, and we'll look at the question and the answer and how these 2 work performance reports and enterprise environmental factors, how they will help you answer that particular question. And we also need the organizational process assets so that we can use appropriate status report templates and follow any existing policies about project reporting. We also want to learn from the other project managers who came before us and their lessons learned in regards to communications from past projects. Okay, so much for this brief overview. Let's jump into the details of these 4 inputs. A lot of work went into the plan communications management process, where the communications management plan was an output. And right now in our process here, this is where you use it. When you manage communications, it is imperative to look at the communications management plan because it details the approach and decisions that have been made in relation to communications. It describes how to plan, manage, and control communications, and it can include requirements. For example, your project may function under a project management officer, PMO, where you have to adhere to the communications and reporting requirements. Such things as regular project status reporting could be required by your PMO. There could be guidelines as well. For example, there may be some guidelines around expectations, around maximum response times to emails and voicemails or other correspondence. So you should have a good idea about when it would be best to follow up with a stakeholder after you send out your communications. There could also be constraints that are defined in your communications management plan in regards to time or money, so schedule or budget. For example, if you have a team that is distributed around the world, but your budget doesn't allow for lengthy international phone calls, well, that means you're going to have to figure out a way to use cheaper, less expensive means of communication, like voice over IP, like a Skype communication, or something along those lines that will keep your budget in check. And now let's move on to that question that I was alluding to a little earlier on. What is it that every single stakeholder on your project usually wants to know? Well, the number one question they ask of you as the project manager is this: how's the project doing? Or something along those lines. Then you need to provide stakeholders a status on cost and schedule and performance. The way to answer this question is by providing information from the physical or electronic representation of work performance information compiled in project documents intended to generate decisions, actions, or awareness, which is, of course, the definition of the work performance reports according to the PMBOK guide. This is our second input. Work performance reports are outputs from the monitor and control project work process. The work performance reports will give you the information which you should analyze, and you can then present that to provide the appropriate context or explanation for the results. If appropriate and the information that you have warrants it, you may also request something of your stakeholders in return, perhaps a change request for a schedule change or a request to use management reserves. In other words, the work performance reports include information on project performance and status, and they provide the basis for the content of the communications that you are creating, distributing, storing, etc. in our process here. And by the way, for the PMP exam, there is great emphasis on the metrics and reports that we get from doing earned value management in the project cost management knowledge area. The information in your work performance reports should be thorough, accurate, and timely for you to achieve your communications objectives. For example, let's assume that a project metric in a work performance report is inaccurate. Once this error is discovered, your communications management plan would likely dictate that you immediately issue a corrected version along with communication to clarify the inaccuracy. Enterprise environmental factors are the next input to the managed communications process. You should already know that the PMBOK guide defines enterprise environmental factors as the conditions that are not under the immediate control of the team that influence, constrain, or direct the project, program, or portfolio. It is important because it influences how you will be managing your communications process. There are many factors that impact the process. For example, organizational culture. This is not just about nationalities and countries. For organizational culture, you could have to understand elements such as structure, value, style, and skills which are at play in your organization. You must understand the culture and interactions among these elements if you want to make sure that you provide the right message to the right people at the right time. But it could also mean government or industry standards and regulations. If you do not know what they are or how they are implemented, you are in trouble, especially if you are in a highly regulated industry like energy production or distribution or banking. Misunderstanding or misinterpreting these rules and standards will jeopardize your project. Failure to do this probably means that you have to start all over. Now, that is something you do not want to have to tell your project sponsor. Another enterprise environmental factor that you have to consider for your project is the Project Management Information System, the PMIS. This can range from a spreadsheet to Microsoft Project to a sophisticated project management system that includes resource management, risk management, change control, and so on. The PMIS affects your communications. The type of system that you have governs how you interact with, when you interact with, and what type of project information is available to you and your stakeholders, and expected from you as well. Your organization may prescribe that you use project management information systems for some of your communications. Different ones have different capabilities. Some, for example, might have robust capabilities, including reporting, where you can automate who has access or who is automatically receiving a report that is generated. You may have some decisions to make as to how to configure it for your project, or it may limit you in how you use it for communications. In general, for project management information systems and other enterprise environmental factors, be proactive. Know these factors and manage their impact on project communications. You have a wealth of information available to you for managing your communications through our fourth and final input, your organizational process assets. For example, your organizational policies may dictate the media that you have to use and when. These decisions and the acknowledgement of the fact that you are adhering to this policy should be documented in your communications management plan, and then here in this process we execute on it. We already mentioned how templates allow you to jumpstart creating your communications. We were talking about status report templates earlier from your PMO or project management office. You likely have to conform to templates that you will find along with examples within your organization's knowledge bases. And you may be able to search for historical information as well. For example, if you were to write about your accomplishments on your IT project, you may be able to access an article featuring the most recent IT implementation. You would get a better idea of what you want to follow or perhaps do a little differently for your own communications. Or perhaps there is a lessons learned database from past projects which describes lessons on communications which you can now follow. You may have a database of possible public relations firm providers or marketing consultants who you might use if you have more challenging outside communications to handle on your project. And with that, we have come to the end of part 1 here in Manage Communications. So it's time for Justine to say,
send postcards.
And I say, until next time.